She answered all questions frankly, and she told all the story of her visions and of her experiences with the angels and what they said to her. And the manner of the telling was so unaffected and so earnest and sincere, and made it all seem so lifelike and real that even the hard, practical court forgot itself and sat motionless and mute, listening with a charmed and wondering interest to the end. And if you would have other testimony than mine, look in the histories and you will find where an eyewitness giving sworn testimony in the rehabilitation process said that she told that tale with a noble dignity and simplicity, and as to its effect, says in substance what I have said. 17. She was 17, and all alone, and all alone. On her bench by herself, yes, was not afraid. Face that great company of erudite doctors of law and theology, and by the help of no art learned in the schools, but using only the enchantments which were hers by nature, of youth, sincerity, a voice soft and musical, and an eloquence whose source was the heart, not the head, she laid that spell upon them. Now, wasn't that a beautiful thing to see? If I could, I would put it before you just as I saw it, then I know what you would say. As I have told you, she could not read. One day they harried and pestered her with argument, reasonings, objections, and other wisely and wordy trivialities, gathered out of the works of this and that and the other great theological authority, until at last her patience vanished, and she turned upon them sharply and said, I don't know A from B, but I know this, that I have come by command of the Lord of heaven to deliver Orleans from the English power and crown the king at Rheims. And the matters you are puttering over are of no consequence. Necessarily, these were trying days for her and wearing for everybody that took part but her. Her share was the hardest, for she had no holidays, but must be always on hand and stay the long hours through, whereas this, that, and the other inquisitor could absent himself and rest up from his fatigues when he got worn out. And yet she showed no weariness, and but seldom let fly her temper. As a rule, she put her day through calm, alert, patient fencing with these veteran masters of scholarly sword play, and coming out always with a scratch. One day a Dominican sprung upon her a question which made everybody cock up his ears with interest. As for me, I trembled and said to myself, she is caught this time, poor Joan, for there is no way of answering this. The sly Dominican began in this way, in a sort of indolent fashion, as if the thing he was about was a matter of no moment. You assert that God has willed to deliver France from the English bondage. Yes, he has willed it. You wish for the men-at-arms so that you may go to the relief of Orleans, I believe. Yes, and the sooner the better. Good. God is all-powerful and able to do whatsoever thing he wills to do. Is that not so? Most surely. None doubts it. The Dominican lifted his head suddenly and sprang this question I have spoken of with exultation. Then answer me this, if he has willed to deliver France, and is able to do whatsoever he will, where is the need for men-at-arms? There was a fine stir and commotions when he said that, and a sudden thrusting forward of heads and putting up hands to ears to catch the answer. And the Dominican wagged his head with satisfaction and looked about him, collecting his applause, for it shone in every face. But Joan was not disturbed. There was no note of disquiet in her voice when she answered. He helps those who help themselves. The sons of France will fight the battles, but he will give the victory. You could see a light of admiration swept the house from face to face like a ray of sun. Even the Dominican himself looked pleased to see his master stroke so nearly parried, fencing term, P-A-R-I-E-D, parried, and I heard a venerable bishop mutter, in the phrasing common to priests and people in the robust time, "By God, the child has said true. He willed that Goliath should be slain, and he sent a child like this to do it." Another day, when the musician had dragged along until everybody looked drowsy and tired but Joan, Brother Seguin, professor of theology at the University of Poitiers, who was a sour and sarcastic man, fell to plying Joan with all sorts of nagging questions in his bastard Limousin French, for he was from Limoges. Finally he said, "How is it that you could understand these angels? What language they speak? French? Indeed. How pleasant to know that our language is so honored. Good French? Yes, perfect. Perfect, eh? Well, certainly you ought to know it was even better than your own, eh? As to that, I believe I cannot say," said she, and was going on, but stopped. Then she added, almost as if she were saying it to herself, "Still, it was an improvement on yours. Still, it was an improvement on yours." I knew there was a chuckle back of her eyes, for all their innocence. Everybody shouted. Brother Seguin was nettled and asked brusquely, "Do you believe in God?" Joan answered with an irritating nonchalance, "Oh, well, yes. Better than you, it is likely." Brother Seguin lost his patience to heap sarcasm after sarcasm upon her, and finally burst out in angry earnest, exclaiming, "Very well, I can tell you this. You whose belief in God is so great, God has not willed that any shall believe in you without a sign. Where is your sign? Show it." This roused Joan, and she was on her feet in a moment, and flung out her retort with spirit. "I have not come to Poitiers to show signs and do miracles. Send me to Orleans, and you shall have signs enough. Give me men at arms, few or many, and let me go." The fire was leaping from her eyes. Ah, the heroic little figure. Can't you see her? There was a great burst of acclamations, and she sat down blushing, for it was not in her delicate nature to like being conspicuous. The speech and that episode about the French language scored 2 points against Brother Seguin, while he scored nothing against Joan. Yet, sour man as he was a manly man and honest, and you can see by the histories, for at the rehabilitation, he could have hidden these unlucky incidents if he had chosen, but he didn't do it, but spoke them right out in his evidence. On one of the latter days of that 3 weeks, session the grown On one of the latter days of that 3 week session, the gowned scholars and professors made one grand assault all along the line, fairly overwhelming Joan with objections and arguments culled from the writings of every ancient and illustrious authority of the Roman Church. She was well nigh smothered, but at last she shook herself free and struck back, crying out, "Listen, the book of God is worth more than all these you cite, and I stand upon it. And I tell you, there are things in that book that not you can read with all your learning." From the first time she was the guest by invitation of the Dame de Rabuteau, wife of Councillor of the Parliament of Poitiers, and to that about the smaller waves, let us come to the largest one of all. The wave that swept a small fry quite off our feet. What is small fry quite? No, it's the word small, the word fry, and then quite off our feet, and almost drowned us with joy. The day of the great verdict, couriers had been dispatched to the king with it, and the next morning, bright and early, the clear notes of a bugle came floating to us on the crisp air, and we pricked up our ears and began to count them. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, 3 again. And out we skipped and went flying, for that formula was used only when the king's herald at arms would deliver a proclamation to the people. As we hurried along, people came racing out of every street and house and alley, men, women, and children, all flushed, excited, and throwing lacking articles of clothing on as they ran. Still, those clear notes pealed out, and still the rush of people increased till the whole town was abroad and streaming along the principal street. At last we reached the square, which was now packed with citizens, and there, high on the pedestal of the great cross, we saw the herald in his brilliant costume, with his servitors about him. The next moment he began his delivery in the powerful voice proper to his office. Know, all men, and take heed, therefore, that the Most High, the most illustrious Charles, by the grace of God, King of France, hath been pleased to confer upon his well-beloved servant Joan of Arc, called the Maid, the title emoluments, authorities, and dignities of General-in-Chief of the armies of France. Here 1,000 caps flew into the air, and the multitude burst into a hurricane of cheers that raged and raged till it seemed as if it would never come to an end. But at last it did. Then the herald went on and finished. And hath appointed to be her lieutenant and chief of staff a prince of his royal house, his grace the Duke of Alençon. That was the end, and the hurricane began again and was split up into innumerable strips by the blowers of it, and wafted through all the lanes and streets of the town. General of the armies of France, with a prince of the blood for a subordinate. Yesterday she was nothing, today she was this. Yesterday she was not even a sergeant, not even a corporal, not even a private. Today, with one step, she was at the top. Yesterday she was less than nobody to the newest recruit. Today her command was Law to La Hire, Sontrails, the Bastard of Orleans, and all those other veterans of old renown, illustrious masters of the trade of war. These were the thoughts I was thinking. I was trying to realize the strange and wonderful thing that had happened, you see. My minds were traveling back and presently lighted upon a picture which was still so new and fresh in my memory that it seemed a matter of only yesterday. And indeed, its date was no further back than the 5 days of January. This is what it was: a peasant girl in a far-off village, her 17th year not yet quite completed, and herself and her village as unknown as if they had been on the other side of the globe. She had picked up a friendless wanderer somewhere and brought it home, a small gray kitten in a forlorn and starving condition, and had fed it and comforted it and got its confidence and made it believe in her, and now it was curled up in her lap asleep, and she was knitting a coarse stocking and thinking, dreaming about what one may never know. And now, the kitten had hardly had time to become a cat, and yet already the girl is general of the armies of France, with a prince of the blood to give orders to. And out of her village obscurity her name has climbed up like the sun and is visible from all corners of the land. It made me dizzy to think of these things. They were so out of the common order and seemed so impossible.